All right, let's dive into this. You wanted to explore the psychology of obedience to authority.
Yeah.
And wow, this source material you sent over, it's pretty intense.
Yeah.
We're going to be listening to excerpts from a lecture, looks like,
Okay.
that analyzes Stanley Milgram's famous obedience experiment.
Yes.
And then
It takes it further.
it applies those.
Yeah, applies it to some real-world
Chilling real world.
events.
Yeah.
Milgram's work is really
Mm-hmm.
a classic in social psychology.
I see where.
It is. It's,
Yeah.
it reveals some uncomfortable truths about human nature
Absolutely.
and the power of situations to shape our behavior.
Okay, so for anyone who isn't familiar with
Right.
Milgram's experiments, can you give us a quick rundown?
Absolutely.
I think everyone listening has heard about them,
Sure.
but might need a refresher.
So in the basic setup, participants believed that they were taking part in a study about learning and memory. They were told to administer electric shocks to another person,
Okay.
the learner, whenever they got a question wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And the shocks increased in voltage with each wrong answer.
Oh, wow.
Now, here's the crucial part.
Okay.
The learner was actually an actor,
Right.
and the shocks weren't real.
It was all a setup.
The real focus was on how far the participant would go
Interesting.
in obeying the experimenter's instructions to administer these supposed shocks.
So they weren't actually being shocked,
No, they weren't.
but the person thought they were shocking them.
That's right.
Got it.
That's right.
I remember learning about this in college, and the results were truly shocking, pun intended, I guess.
Yeah, yeah.
A majority of participants continued to administer the shocks, even when they believed they were causing severe pain.
Exactly.
Right.
The study showed that even ordinary people,
Right.
when placed in a particular situation
Yeah.
and confronted with an authority figure, can be led to do things they would normally consider morally reprehensible.
It makes you wonder, what was going on in their minds? Did
Yeah.
they really believe they were hurting someone?
That's where Milgram's concept of the agentic state comes in.
Okay, what is that?
He argued that when people view themselves as merely agents
Mm-hmm.
carrying out someone else's wishes,
Right.
they experience a diminished sense of personal responsibility
Okay.
for their actions.
So it's like shifting the blame, saying, I was just following orders.
Exactly.
But how does that psychological shift actually happen?
Right.
Isn't there some inner voice screaming, this is wrong?
What's fascinating is that the lecture connects this agentic state directly to the Millet massacre.
Oh, wow.
And it uses a chilling firsthand account
Oh, God.
from a soldier who participated in the killings
Really?
of hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians.
It's hard to even fathom something like that happening.
The soldier in the recording says, and I quote, "I felt like I was ordered to do it, and it seemed like at the time I felt like I was doing the right thing."
Oh, my God.
This quote really illustrates how the agentic state
Right.
can operate in a high-pressure, chaotic environment
Yeah.
like war.
So these soldiers were trained to obey orders without question, to dehumanize the enemy,
Absolutely.
and to see their actions as serving a greater purpose.
Exactly.
Ah.
So it's like,
And the lecture argues that these factors,
yeah,
combined with the intense stress of combat,
right.
created a perfect storm that made it easier for them to override their moral compass.
It's unsettling to think that this kind of thing could happen in a democratic society like the United States.
Right.
I mean, we often assume that obedience to authority is mainly a problem in authoritarian regimes.
That's a common misconception.
Okay.
While authoritarian regimes might be more overt in demanding obedience, the reality is that authority is inherent.
In any social structure,
Yeah.
the potential for conflict between conscience and obedience exists everywhere,
Okay.
from families and schools to workplaces and governments.
So are you saying this type of blind obedience could happen anywhere?
The lecture uses a range of examples
Okay.
to highlight that point.
Okay.
It talks about the Stanford prison experiment,
Oh, yeah.
where students quickly conformed to roles of guards and prisoners,
Right.
displaying brutal behavior in a matter of days.
Wow.
And it touches on the Watergate scandal,
Oh, right.
which showed how even in a democratic government, the pressure to obey and conform can lead to ethical lapses and abuses of power.
It seems like there are parallels between these seemingly different situations.
Yes.
In each case, individuals were placed in a situation where they were expected to conform to roles or obey authority figures, and that pressure led them to do things they might not otherwise have done.
Precisely.
So, like,
The lecture argues that the potential for this kind of blind obedience isn't about individual morality,
Right.
so much as understanding the power of situations to shape our behavior.
Okay, so we've established that blind obedience can happen anywhere and lead to awful outcomes.
Yeah.
But how exactly do people disconnect from the morality of their actions?
Right.
How can they convince themselves that doing something wrong is actually right?
Yeah, that's where things get even more interesting.
Okay.
The lecture dives into the use of euphemisms and language manipulation as a means to distance individuals from the true implications of their actions.
Interesting.
For example, it highlights how during the Vietnam War, Vietnamese people were often referred to as gooks,
Right.
a derogatory term used to dehumanize them.
I see. By
Uh,
dehumanizing the victims, it becomes easier to justify violence against them.
Exactly.
It's like they're creating a mental barrier that shields them from the ethical consequences
That's exactly right.
of their actions.
And the lecture explains this as a way of managing cognitive dissonance,
Okay.
the mental discomfort that comes from holding conflicting beliefs, or engaging in behaviors that clash with our values.
Right.
By using euphemisms and dehumanizing language, people can reduce this dissonance and make it easier to live with their actions.
So even in a situation like my lie, where the horror of what was happening must have been undeniable,
Right.
they could distance themselves psychologically through the language they used
Think
and the
about
roles
that.
they were playing.
It seems unbelievable, but the lecture argues that these psychological mechanisms are incredibly powerful.
Wow.
And it's not just about war or extreme situations.
Mm.
It also points out how these same processes can occur in everyday life,
Really?
in workplaces, schools, and even families,
Oh, wow.
whenever there's a power dynamic
Right.
and pressure to obey.
I see. So it can happen anywhere.
Yeah.
It's disturbing to realize how vulnerable we all are to these kinds of influences. It's like we have this idea of ourselves as moral beings,
Right.
but then you hear stories like my lie and you realize
Yeah.
how easily that morality
Yeah.
can be compromised under pressure.
The lecture really dives into the unsettling implications of Milgram's experiments, highlighting how even well-intentioned people can become complicit in horrific acts.
So how do we reconcile this idea of individual conscience with the reality that our behavior is so susceptible to external pressures?
That's a question that philosophers and psychologists have been wrestling with for centuries.
Mm.
The lecture doesn't offer easy answers,
Okay.
but instead focuses on the importance of awareness.
Mm.
By understanding these psychological mechanisms, by recognizing how easily we can be manipulated by authority
Right.
and by language,
Yeah.
we could start to build up our defenses.
So it's not about becoming completely distrustful of authority,
Yeah.
but about developing a more critical and discerning eye.
Exactly. The lecture uses the trial of Adolf Eichmann,
Okay.
a high-ranking Nazi official, as a case study.
Okay.
Eichmann was responsible for organizing the transportation of millions of Jews
Right.
to concentration camps during the Holocaust.
Yeah. And he famously claimed he was just following orders.
Right. He argued that he was simply a cog in a machine carrying out the directives of his superiors. But the lecture challenges this defense, asking whether it's possible to abdicate moral responsibility simply by claiming obedience.
I mean, that defense seems pretty flimsy when you consider the scale of the atrocities committed.
The lecture delves into the concept of individual responsibility,
Okay.
arguing that even in a hierarchical system, we each have a moral obligation to question orders
Okay.
that violate our conscience.
So even in a situation where you're facing immense pressure to obey,
Right.
there's still a choice to be made.
The lecture suggests that there's always a choice, but recognizing that choice can be incredibly difficult in the moment.
Especially when you consider the potential consequences of disobedience.
Exactly. And that's where things get really complicated, because it's one thing to say we should disobey unjust orders.
Right.
But it's another thing entirely to actually do it,
Yeah.
especially when your job,
Right.
your reputation, or even your life might be on the line.
It takes incredible courage to stand up to authority, especially when everyone around you is conforming.
The lecture touches on this aspect of conformity as well,
Okay.
using examples like the Asch conformity experiments,
Right?
where individuals were willing to publicly agree with obviously incorrect judgments, simply because everyone else in the group was doing the same.
It's amazing how much power social pressure can have over our perceptions and behavior.
It really is.
Yeah.
And the lecture argues that this pressure to conform can be even more powerful
Wow.
when it comes from authority figures
Right.
whom we perceive as having legitimacy or expertise.
I I'm starting to see how all these different pieces fit together.
Yeah.
It's not just about obedience, it's about conformity, social pressure, language manipulation.
That's right.
All these factors working in concert to create a situation where it becomes incredibly difficult to resist.
You hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
The lecture emphasizes that understanding these psychological mechanisms is crucial
Yeah.
to developing the ability to resist unjust authority.
So knowledge is power, as they say.
In this case, I think it's safe to say that awareness is power.
Okay.
The more we understand these psychological traps,
Mm-hmm.
the better equipped we are to avoid them.
But how do we cultivate that inner strength, that moral courage to actually stand up and say no when we know something is wrong?
That's the ultimate challenge, isn't it?
Yeah.
The lecture suggests that it starts with recognizing the power of language.
Mm.
We need to be vigilant
Right.
about how language is being used to shape our perceptions
Yeah.
and manipulate our behavior.
It reminds me of what we were talking about earlier with euphemisms. The lecture gave the example of how the Nazis used euphemisms to disguise the true nature of their crime.
Right, terms like final solution
Wow.
were deliberately chosen to mask the horrific reality of the Holocaust.
It's chilling to think how easily language can be used to sanitize violence.
Yes.
And make the unthinkable seem acceptable.
The lecture argues that this kind of linguistic manipulation is still prevalent today. We see it in politics, in the media, and even in everyday conversations.
So how do we counter this kind of subtle manipulation? It feels like it's all around us.
It starts with being aware,
Okay.
with paying close attention to the language that's being used,
Yeah?
and questioning the assumptions that are being made.
Okay.
It's about developing a critical ear and refusing to passively absorb information without scrutinizing it.
So it's about being an active listener,
Yes,
not just a passive recipient.
precisely. It's about asking questions,
Mm-hmm.
challenging assumptions,
Yeah.
and looking beyond the surface
Yeah.
to understand the deeper meaning behind the words.
It sounds like we need to be constantly questioning, constantly pushing back against the narratives that are being presented to us. But isn't that exhausting?
It can be, there's no doubt about it.
Yeah.
But the lecture argues that this kind of critical engagement is essential if
Yeah.
we want to avoid being manipulated by authority
Right.
and maintain our moral compass.
And I imagine it gets easier with practice. The more we question, the more we challenge, the more it becomes second nature.
I think that's a great insight. It's like building a muscle. The more we exercise our critical thinking skills,
Right.
the stronger they become.
So it's not about becoming cynical or distrustful of everything we hear,
No,
but about developing a healthy skepticism
exactly.
and a willingness to think for ourselves.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that authority figures, no matter how legitimate or well-intentioned, can be wrong.
Yeah.
And it's about trusting our own judgment
Right.
and having the courage to speak up when something doesn't feel right.
This has been a truly eye-opening conversation. I feel like I'm starting to understand the complexities of obedience and the subtle ways in which we can all be influenced to act against our own values.
I think you've grasped the key takeaways from the lecture.
Okay.
It's not about simple answers or easy solutions, but about recognizing the power of situations to shape our behavior
Yeah.
and developing the critical thinking skills to resist those influences.
It feels like we've uncovered some... Yeah.
Pretty unsettling truths
Yeah.
about human nature
Mm-hmm.
and the power of situations to shape our behavior.
Yeah.
It's a lot to process.
You're right. It's not light material.
Yeah.
But as we wrap up our deep dive
Right.
into obedience to authority, I think it's important to shift our focus
Okay.
from the problem to potential solutions.
Solutions. Okay.
What can we do with these insights? How can we apply this knowledge to our own lives?
I'm glad you brought that up. It's easy to feel overwhelmed with all
Right.
this information
Yeah.
and kind of helpless, like
Yeah.
we're all just puppets
Right.
at the mercy of these psychological forces. But I think there are things we can do
Absolutely.
to become more aware
Yes.
and more resistant to manipulation.
It starts with remembering the key takeaways from the lecture.
Okay.
First and foremost, be aware of the power of authority.
Right.
Recognize that anyone in a position of power, even if they seem well-intentioned,
Mm-hmm.
has the potential to influence our behavior in ways that might conflict with our values. So it's not about being suspicious of everyone in a leadership role,
Right.
but about maintaining a healthy skepticism
Exactly.
and recognizing the potential for these dynamics to play out.
And along with that awareness,
Okay.
cultivate critical thinking.
So it's like,
Don't just blindly accept orders or directives,
Okay.
especially when they make you uncomfortable or clash with your moral compass.
I think that's a crucial point.
Yeah.
It's so easy to fall into the trap of thinking, well, they must know better than I do.
Yeah.
But the lecture reminds us that authority figures aren't infallible,
Absolutely.
and it's important to trust our own judgment.
Right. Asking questions,
Yeah.
seeking clarification,
Uh-huh.
and considering the potential consequences of our actions
Right.
are all part of critical thinking.
Okay.
And sometimes it might even mean respectfully pushing back
Oh, wow.
against an order or directive if you truly believe it's wrong.
That takes courage, especially in a workplace setting where there might be consequences for speaking up.
It does.
Mm.
But remember, true loyalty isn't blind obedience.
Right.
It's about having the courage to point out when something is wrong and advocate for what you believe is right, even if it's uncomfortable.
And what about the role of language?
Yeah.
We talked earlier about how euphemisms
Yes.
and other forms of linguistic manipulation can be used to mask the true nature of actions or policies.
That's another key area where we can apply this knowledge.
Okay.
Be mindful of the language being used by authority figures.
Right.
Look out for euphemisms, generalizations,
Mm-hmm.
and other rhetorical devices that can distort reality
Right.
or downplay the consequences of actions.
It's like being a detective,
Right.
learning to decode the language of power and uncover the truth behind the words.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And remember, it's not just about analyzing the language of others,
Right.
but also being mindful of our own language.
Just so.
Well, think about the words we use to describe people or situations.
Mm-hmm.
Do our words reflect reality? Or are we using language that dehumanizes others or justifies harmful actions?
Okay.
It's important to be aware of our own biases and how they might be reflected in our language.
That's a powerful insight. It's easy to focus on how others use language to manipulate, but it's equally important to be self-reflective about our own use of language.
And finally, trust your gut. If something feels wrong, it probably is.
Right.
Don't dismiss those inner alarm bells
Yeah.
or rationalize away your discomfort.
Our intuition can be a powerful guide, especially when it comes to ethical dilemmas.
Exactly. It's about tuning into that inner voice and having the courage to speak up, to challenge authority when it's warranted,
Right.
and to stand up for what you believe in, even when it's difficult.
So in a nutshell, the key to resisting unjust authority is a combination of awareness, critical thinking, and courage.
I think that sums it up perfectly.
Well, this deep dive has been incredibly thought-provoking. I feel like I've learned a lot about myself and about the subtle ways in which we can all be influenced to act against our better judgment.
I'm glad to hear that. I think the most important thing is to keep these insights in mind as we go about our daily lives. We all encounter situations where we're faced with pressure to conform or obey.
Right.
And being aware of these psychological mechanisms can help us make more conscious and ethical choices.
I think you've given us a lot to think about. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the fascinating and sometimes unsettling world of obedience to authority.
It was my pleasure. And for you listening, I hope this deep dive has empowered you to be more aware, more discerning, and more courageous in navigating the complexities of authority in your own life.